Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1270. Top of page Aleph Ayin Beis. And we learned about the Reshimu, all coming to explain how the Sheresh HaKelim, the root of the containers, are rooted in the deepest levels of the etzem, higher than the root of the energies, the kav. So briefly, what we learned yesterday was, as he says in the page 1269, the two elements, components in the Reshimu. One is the etzem nekudus Reshimu, and there's the Ein Sof Sheba. As we explained, it's not Ein Sof as in revealed, it's in a complete state of Helam. And just for the record, if you want to know more about the Reshimu, you have to go back to chapters all the way in the beginning of Ayin Beis, chapters begins discussing the Reshimu in chapter, I believe, chapter 8. Yeah. Chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10 and 11 all talk about the Reshimu, and it's very relevant to what we're discussing here. And there he makes it very clear that Reshimu is everything is in a state of concealment. So there's the etzem nekudus Reshimu, he said, was the koyach hagvul, the power of gvul of Ein Sof. Within it lies the Eir HaBli, but it's concealed because now what is Gabrus? What is the intensification? What is the most powerful force here is the Koyach HaGvul. Before the Tzimtzum, it was the other way around. It was the Eir HaBli that encompassed the Koyach HaGvul, the infinite light and the infinite divine consciousness that encompassed also the power to create the finite. Now it's the power that creates the finite that is more dominant because the Tzimtzum concealed that Eir, and within it also lies the Eir, and that's why it's called a Reshimu, like he said. So what you see from this is that the Reshimu is not a leftover for the Tzimtzum as in a diminished Eir. It's a force, it's a power of its own, the power of the Koyach HaGvul. And leinoga ba'at Tzimtzum, he said, ki ba'er hanichol b'Reshimu leinoga ba'at Tzimtzum. If the Tzimtzum did not affect, what does that mean? Not Eir as in a revealed light in the letters and in the power of the letters to reveal Eir, and also, like he says, from Primis Eir, like I explained yesterday. What means Primis Eir? It's not Eir, revealed Eir, it's the inner dimension of Eir, its intention. So the Reshimu essentially carries the very core message, if you wish, of God's inner intention in all of existence, in the Kavanah Al-Yena, whereas Eir reveals, and the Reshimu is in a state of concealment, but it carries it without any being affected or impacted by the Tzimtzum. Then he added, Omnam, Etzem Nekudus Reshimu, which is more than the Eir within the Reshimu, the concealed Eir in the Reshimu. He says, Yeshleimer comes from Etzem Eir Mamish, Helam Eir, that's even higher than Primis Eir. The Etzem Eir, that's higher than Primis Eir. The Kav is only Chetzenius Eir. The Reshimu is Primis Eir, and now he's saying Etzem Nekudus Reshimu is Primis Eir, and he's going to explain what that means. Who? Shalamayim b'chinas Shmoi. Who is Shmoi Belvad? Hoyehu b'Shmoi Belvad. This is the level of who that's higher than Shmoi, and that's where we stopped. So now he's going to explain what he's going to explain this level. What you see here is that he's going deeper and deeper, like I explained yesterday, the Seif Ma'aseh Machshava Tchila, that there's the process of creation, the process of everything, that's the Eir, and there's the Kavanah Primis in it. So he's saying the Sava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyis Leis Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim. The Sava is all the way in Atzmus, and what does he want? Tachtenim, Dira B'Tachtenim. He wants Kalim, and the Kalim on the lowest level of Gashmis and chumrius, yesh, and that's where he wants a dira. So in a way, dira b'tachtenim is rooted higher than oir. He doesn't say it in these aces here, but similarly, the root kalim is rooted higher than oir. So the Reshimu captures more of the etzem than the kav does, as the Rebbe Marash and the Rebbe Rashab explain in Torah Eir, where he says that the Reshimu is kelelas asakel, and the kav goes to each world and each level according to its level. So both are necessary. Now he's going to explain by Inyan Hu, top of page 1270. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So he says now like this: by Inyan Hu, the Inyan of this is the Hine Mavur b'mokem acher. It's explained elsewhere. Ukemeduma shenisker gam ken leil. He says kemeduma, and I think that it was also mentioned above. So in other words, the Rebbe Rashab did not go check, so to speak, but he thinks it was also mentioned above. I also think it was mentioned above. Who am I compared to the Rebbe Rashab? But nevertheless, I do recall that this was mentioned above. But regardless, it's interesting he should say Ukumeduma. The Asius, so what do we learn? The Asius Sharshan Mibchinas Yechida Shabanefesh. The letters are rooted in the Yechida Shabanefesh, which is the deepest part of the soul. So let's for a moment explain. When a human being expresses themselves, there's ideas. You express ideas. Expression can be in thought, speech, or action. Letters is the way you express it. It's like the channels. If you only had ideas, it would only be oir. If there were only ideas and you didn't have letters, you wouldn't have expression. But the question is, where do the very letters come from? So he quoted earlier from Geras HaKedesh that it comes from Kadmus HaSeichel. I'm not sure why he doesn't mention that here. I even believe it's in volume 3, earlier on, that the Eishis come from Kadmus HaSeichel. Let me look it up. Let me just see. I'm almost sure it's very early here. I think it's on page. I'm looking right now at page 1209. I thought it was there. I still think it's there. I don't see it right now. Okay, I'll look around some more for this. But regardless, so it does say, he's saying now that we did learn that the Eishis are rooted in Yechida Shabanefesh. What does that mean? That the Kalim are rooted higher than the Oir. Like he said, V'zehu, well, before I complain. So it's rooted higher than the Oir. Now, usually we think of Kalim as being lower than Oir. There's Oir, and then you need Kalim to channel. There's wine, and then you put it into cups. But here we're talking about who created the very cups, who created the containers. So the Eishis are rooted in Yechida Shabanefesh, which he's comparing here to the Reshimu being rooted in Etzem Ha'oir, Helam Ha'oir, that's higher than Primis Ha'oir even. V'zehu sibas chilukei Eishis v'atzirufim b'dibur. And it's this high, deep level that causes the different combinations, the different letters and combination of letters in speech. Because you see, for example, two different people, he's going to say, can express an idea in two different ways. Ukamoi shnei chachamim, like two wise people, she'emlim davar sichli echad, they're both expressing the same idea, a certain idea. V'zeh emer be'esis v'tzirufim elu, and one of the people, one of the wise men, one of these wise individuals says it in particular letters and combination of letters and phrases and words and phrases. And another person expresses that same idea with a different combination, with different words, different letters, and different combinations. You see this all the time. Two people can communicate the same idea in two different ways. Chassidus sometimes brings an example of the Rashba, and I think and another one of the Rishenim, that they explain an idea in the Gemara, they just have different ways of explaining it. Not different ways of understanding it, different words and different expressions to explain the same idea. So the question is, if the aces are just superficial, external channels that come from the oir, it should be one way to express it. Why is it two different ways? What's defining that this one is using these letters and words and this one's using a different combination? She says, Zehu mebchinis Yechida shebenefesh. This is coming from the innermost the fifth deepest dimension in the soul, Yechida, higher than nefesh, ruch, neshama, and chaya. Shehi hanesenes esis lekol echad ve'echad. That this level of Yechida gives letters to each person, kefi mahus etzem nafshe, according to the personality of his very core soul. So that's why this person expresses in this way, and this one expresses the same idea in a different way. So the Yechida is defining these differences. So it's not just that the oir is the difference, the idea. Even the same oir has different types of kelim, and those are rooted in Yechida shebenefesh. And all this is now going to explain this same thing now, Reshimu. Same thing you can say above, the etzma Reshimu, the very core of the Reshimu. Not the oir within it, the concealed oir, but the very core, the idea that there's a koyach hagvul, there's a power of letters. Hey, mebchinas helama oir shalamayim mebchinas hagilu legamri. That comes from a helama oir, from the etzem, like he said, completely concealed. That's higher completely from Gilui. In other words, the very Kalim, why is one soul shaped in these type of letters and one soul expresses in this type of letters? That's because it's rooted in a place that's higher than the Gilui of the Ur. So that's the first thing. Now, he says it very condensed in a very compact way, so it needs to be maybe explained more. But let's first read till the end of the paragraph, and I'm going to go back and explain. Then he gives one final yeshlemer, the gam yeshlemer, and we could also say the sharsha, the root of the Reshimu, who mebchinas helam ha'atzmi. Helam ha'atzmi means the core state of concealment that's completely beyond revelation. The Ein Sof of Ein Sof, the hainu b'chinas shmoi hakol b'atzmus mamish. This is shmoi, the name of Hashem, the way it's encompassed in Atzmus mamish, mamish and Atzmus, she'eina b'chinas klal. That's not at all. Ki'im b'chinas Yecholes. Now we're going all the way to the level of Yecholes, which is the highest way we describe things in Atzmus. Just means God's capacity to do something. It doesn't have any manifestation. It's only Yecholes, like it says elsewhere. And now he concludes. I'm going to explain in a moment. Let me just finish the line. V'nimtza, move on. So from this we derive, is understood, Yisran Mailas Reshima, the quality, the exceptionalism, the uniqueness, the advantage of the Reshima she Gavoya Harba Mebchinas Hakav. How the Reshima is far greater, higher than the level of the Kav, which is Gilui and Ur. Now, he's going to explain this more in the next paragraph, but let me just sum up what we just learned. So now he's come to the end. Well, end. If you recall back, you go back to page 1268, when he said, V'hini, ha'inyan hudini, yadu d'sher shekem b'chinas Reshimu, v'sher she'ez ha'merkav. He now finishing that topic, how the Reshimu is higher than the Kav. So I explained it yesterday in the context of Dir B'Tachtenim, that the Primis HaKavona is the Kalim, not the Ur. Even though the Ur reflects the divine and is God's way of expressing himself, divine consciousness, divine awareness, but the Etzem is higher than awareness and higher than consciousness, as we learned. And you see here how he's climbed the ladder. That first he's explained how the Ur in the Reshimu is the Primis Ur, which is higher than the Chetzenius Ur. He called it Koydem Aleis HaRatzon. Then he went and said even further that the Etzem Nekudas Reshimu is Etzem Ha'Or. And now he's gone even higher and say that is the level of Etzem Ha'Or is Helam Ha'Or Shalamayim Chins Primis Ha'Or. So he called this the level of Hu, which is the level, he compared it to the letters as they're rooted in Yechida. And then finally he went to the highest level, Yeshlemer, that's rooted in Helam Atzmi. The way it's encompassed in Atzmus, higher than Ur altogether. It's only the Yecholes of Atzmus. That's the last thing he just said. So you see in the Reshimu itself, he spoke in several levels. So let me explain. I explained it somewhat yesterday, but I'll just go over a bit somewhat different osius, different letter, different words. The example Chassidus gives for understanding these levels that we're describing is from Ipsara Erzelaka, from our flesh, my flesh shall behold God, from our own faculties. Every faculty is called a koyach, and it's called koyches gluyim. When a faculty is obvious and is functioning, whether it's my speaking right now, or it's the power to see, or to hear, or to write, or to walk, or to talk, the power to seichel, midas, emotions, whatever faculty a human being has, when it's in a functional, revealed state, it's called a koyach goli. It's a revealed faculty. Right now, my eyes are seeing something. My ears are hearing, I'm speaking. And you're also using your faculties. That's called koyches gluyim. However, we all know that's the surface, like the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the koyches gluyim, so-called within them, lies a thing called koyches nelamim. What happens when I'm not speaking? So you can't call it the koyach hadibur begali. I'm not speaking in a revealed way, but you can't say I don't have a koyach hadibur. I have the power to speak. I'm just not actually speaking. It's not in a revealed way. So we call it the koyach hadibur hanelam. What does it mean, concealed? That I can speak any given moment. It's just that I'm not speaking right now. In a way, when we're asleep, the koyches gluyim, so to speak, go into a sleep state. And maybe only external remains, like breathing and other things. And they all go into like a helam state, most of the faculties. Now, does it end there? The koyach nelam? No, because the koyach nelam is still just one step away from being revealed. Even if I'm not speaking right now, it doesn't take much effort for me to begin speaking. So then there's the next level is called the koyach, sometimes hiyuli, sometimes called the koyach etzem hakoyach, koyach etzem. For example, let's say I use speech. Let me use another example. Well, let's use speech as well, since I'm using it already. What about if I go and take speech lessons and I learn to speak better than I speak regularly? What's happening? Learn how to speak with louder voice or with more discipline, with more command. You're reaching now deeper in where the koyches come from in the nefesh, and you're actualizing them. An easier way to understand it is, let's talk about the power to throw. Koyach hazrika. So when you're actually throwing something, you're throwing a stone, that's called a revealed faculty. What happens when you're not throwing it, but you have the capacity to throw it? That's a koyach hanelam. So what happens if you throw a stone? If the farthest you can throw a stone is 100 feet, but then you exercise and you condition, and you come back after a while, your muscles have now developed, and you can throw 200 feet. So it's more than just the koyach hanelam. Koyach hanelam was 100 feet potentially. Now that you've exercised, you've caused the koyach to reach deeper into what we'll call the koyach hayuli or koyach ha'atzmi. You're now accessing something that is even deeper than the initial potential. But it doesn't end there. If you go even deeper, there are levels called the hayuli atzmi, or the etzem, the koyach within the etzem nefesh, and so on. So there, the koyach doesn't even have a faculty. There you're reaching now into levels that are higher than the actual faculty. Similar to the artist can create art, then he has the potential to create other types of art, and then there are things that are deeper in his potential that is even beyond being an artist. But but his faculties originate from there. So the deeper you go into the soul, the more the faculty becomes less of a tangible entity, and it becomes more the power of the soul to do something. That's a whole different thing when you say, my power to see, I'm actually seeing, I'm the power to see, or I've developed my muscles or my kelim in a way that there's even more oir. Now we're going already into the nefesh, into the deepest part of the soul. The soul is not made up of faculties. It's more than the sum of the parts. And yet the faculties originate from there. So there we call it, sometimes called koiches haklulim benefesh. That would be even deeper than the etzem hakoyach, koiches atzmim. And then there's even higher, which says nefesh neise koiches. The nefesh carries the capacity, the ability to give off faculty, to express itself in these faculties. So as a dugma, the same thing is lamaila. There's how God manifests in a faculty. When you say koyach hachachma, bina, das, chesed, gvura, teferes, netzach, chedus, malchus. These are divine attributes. They're already how God manifests in a faculty. It could be a koyach goli. Chachma is radiating in a revealed way. It can be koyach nelam. Chachma is concealed in a deeper state. Then it could be chachma as it's encompassed in keser or in higher levels, a koyach hakolol, or koyach atzmi, or koyach hakolol benefesh. How about when you go to the highest levels? The highest levels, you don't have faculties anymore. You can't say God is made up of faculties. So you go all the way higher, you can have the chetzeni sa'er, the pnimi sa'er, the etzem ha'er, which is still the etzem hakoyach. It's true, it's not revealed, like I just explained. It's in a concealed state, and a fundamentally concealed state, but it's still associated with the power of chachma, let's say, or at least with the power of expression. Remember, because it's higher than the 10 hidden spheres, but the power of expression. So etzem ha'or is not revealed or, but it's the power to reveal it. It's the power to express. And in the Reshimu, it's concealed. As it comes down levels, it gets more revealed all the way to Alois HaRatzon. Then the Tzimtzum and the Kav reveals the light, but that's all revelation. The Reshimu, on the other hand, is carrying these concealed states in the deeper part of the Etzem, to the point you get to a place that's even higher than Etzem HaOyer, because Etzem HaOyer is still Oyer, but it's in the level of Etzem. How Oyer touches and is part of the essence core. Then he says, there's Shemo Yecholes of Atzmus mamish. We don't even call it a faculty. We don't even call it a function. We call it Yecholes of Atzmus, Yecholes. This is the word the Alter Rebbe used to explain a level. It's just God's ability to do something. So the Reshimu is rooted, he's saying, all the way in Yecholes. Now, the truth is, Oyer also is ultimately rooted in God's Yecholes ability to reveal himself. But we'll soon learn shortly why Kalim or Reshimu, in a way, reveal more of Atzmus than Oyer does, even though everything is rooted there. And that's what we're going to learn in the next section now. Very fascinating piece to explain why Reshimu, because if everything's rooted in Atzmus, the ability to express himself infinitely, the ability to express himself in a finite state, they both come from Atzmus. So why is the Kalim higher than the Oyer? You could say in the level of etzem ha'er, the kelim is higher because it's coming from the power to conceal. The power of restraint, as we spoke about, requires a deeper strength. But in Yecholes of Atzmus, why do you say that Reshimu associates more with Yecholes than does Oir? And that's what we're going to explain now in the next section. But that's an explanation, more or less, of understanding the power of the Reshimu. So an interesting paradox is the less concealed, the less it's concealed, the more atzmi it is. The more it's revealed, the more gili it is. Now, both are necessary. This is not a question about necessity. It's just a question of which is rooted in a higher place. Okay, so that's what he said. Now the oisius are rooted in Yechida shebenefesh, in that deeper place. Okay. Now, I just want to say one more thing before we continue reading, or before I stop for questions. A lot of this is counterintuitive for one reason, for a few reasons, but here's one main reason. Most people think when we talk about material versus spiritual, that God is spiritual and the world is materialistic. That's the way most spiritual disciplines think. You go lahavdil to any of the Far Eastern disciplines, you can live a materialistic life, you can live a spiritual life. Does Yiddishkeit embrace that concept of these two realities? We also talk about spiritual. Neshama is a soul versus a body. We talk about spirit versus matter. Oir keli. But as soon as you say Oir is keli, what are you saying? That there's a third level that's not a Oir and not a keli. The Eibishter. You can't say that God is more spiritual than he is material because he's beyond both. The Rebbe wrote a letter once, I mentioned it here, to a conference on Jewish mysticism in London many years ago. And he wrote a letter and he said the following, that Jewish mysticism is different than all other schools of mysticism in the fact that it teaches that you can reach deeper, through an action than through a meditation. That's what the Rebbe writes. Think about it. Most people would say meditation is far superior to action. Action is maisa. It's good. It's important to act and not just think and feel. But deeper? Because why? Because we would think that spiritual meditation is closer to spiritual than action is. But the Yiddishkeit is not based on two levels. It's based on a third level. That's why when we say God, what do you say about God? That he is holy, not just spiritual. Kedusha is deeper than spiritual. So Oir would be spiritual. Keli would be more material, relatively speaking. But then there's something that's higher than Eris and Kelim that's beyond both. And in a way, Kelim are rooted deeper in that etzem than Maisa, than Oir. That's why the action, Maisa or Iker, Yofa Sha'achas b'tshuva Maisim Tevim be'elam haza, b'kol chay elam haba. 1 hour of tshuva ma'asim tevim in this world, elam hazeh, which is far inferior to the world to come, to the higher spiritual worlds. But one action reaches all the way where the kelim reach to the etzem, to the kavana. So if a God was closer to the spiritual than he is to the material, so for sure Oir is more reflective of Elokus. Oir reveals godliness. The Beis HaMikdash is more revealed than, let's say, in time of Golus. But when you understand the concept that the Eibush is higher than both, then in a way the Helam expresses more of Etzem than the Gilui does. But just to be clear, this doesn't mean that we don't need Giluyim. We need the fusion of both. We want the Gilui of the Etzem. We want the Etzem to be Begili, but never be distracted just by the Giluyim. That's why you have all the stories with the Baal Shem Tov, that the Ish Pasha, the simple person who doesn't have brilliance or scholarship or piety, he touches the etzem because he goes beyond all these giluyim. Now, we don't advocate illiteracy. We don't say just because that farm boy, through his kukuriku, pierced Atzmus, pierced heaven itself, that all the scholars and all the pious Jews couldn't pierce. We don't say, okay, let's all go to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur with kukuriku. We say we learn from the pshittis, from the innocence and simplicity of the child. But then we have to infuse that into our davening, into the Giluim, the famous example, Tfilah La'ani. Kiyatav, Lifnei Hashem, Yishpech Sichi. So the Baal Shem Tov says, why ani? Why like a pauper? Pray like a pauper. And he gives the example. The two people invited to see the king. One is a scholar, a Talmud Chacham, a pious one. He's knowledgeable in all the wisdoms of the world. The other is an illiterate peasant. The first one comes into the palace, and he sees all these collections of art, of music, of literature, all the Giluyim. And he gets so enamored by it and mesmerized and enthralled that he misses his appointment with the king. He never saw anything like this. Comes the pauper, the peasant, illiterate. He doesn't know how to read. He doesn't know what art is. He doesn't know what music is. All these Giluyim mean nothing to him. He walks right through, straight into the king's chamber. Lifnei Hashem yishpech sichi. Before God, I pour out my soul, my words. And he connects with Etzem itself, because the Giluyim can be a distraction. And he asks God, the king, to give him everything, to appreciate all these God's majesty and God's delights. So we don't advocate illiteracy, but we realize that sometimes all the Giluyim, like the Alter Rebbe said, Mili b'shamayim, that all the Giluyim doesn't want Gan Eden and not Elam Haba. He wants Dich, he wants God himself. And then he wants that God to permeate everything, the holy Shtalshlus. So in that sense, Atzmus is neither nor Keli, but Keli in some way touches that Etzem or reaches that Etzem deeper than the does. But we still have to understand. You could say, okay, fine, but also comes from Atzmus. It doesn't come from anywhere else, God forbid. It's also an expression of Atzmus. It's an expression of revelation, but how could you dismiss it? So he's going to explain now the difference between the two. Now, but the truth is, we really learned it in volume 2, especially in Tzadik Daled, when he spoke about how both Yesh and each one express an element of Atzmus, but it's the Yesh that expresses the Mitzirsim Atzmusi of Atzmus more than the I also will say Shmois Tovshin Chavhei, the Rebbe spoke about, which said the Baal Shem Tov says that the pshittus of a simple person reaches pshittus Atzmus, the simplicity and seamlessness of Atzmus. So the Rebbe asked, why don't we say that the expression of godliness reveals the expression of the Etzem? And all this, I think, will be answered here in the next section that we're going to learn now. But I'm going to stop now if anybody wants to ask anything. No questions? Okay. Okay. According to the above, will be understood the Inyan Eres v'Kelim. It's going to bring this back now to the Eres and Kelim, that the whole question began at the bottom of page 1266. He said, where does Simcha Shal Mitzvah works with Kelim? The Neshama says they come into Kelim and they extend from the Kelim. Mitzvahs that expresses of the Evodim of Kelim, how does that reach these deepest levels of Atzmus? We learned how it transcends Ishtalshalus and that you could have the Gili of Tainug Atzmi in Gan Eden. But still was missing, he says, how does it reach such deep and high levels? So this began a whole discussion that the root of Kelim is higher than the root of Ur. So he's not coming back to that, but he's going to add some explanation now in everything we've learned. So he says, in the subject, we learned about how it is before the Tzimtzum, the Reshimu and the Kav after the Tzimtzum, and now he's bringing back to Eres and Kelim in the Shtalshlus. Shesharshan mibchinas Reshimu v'Akav. The root of Eres and Kelim is from the Reshimu and the Kav in the reverse order. The root of Eres energies is the Kav, the thin ray of light, and the root of the container is the Reshimu. The ima yesha eru b'chinas gilui, even though is the level of gilui, revelation. That's a great experience. You reveal godliness. And the keli is a state of confinement, or parameters, or definition, and concealment. So just based on that, it would seem that is higher than keli. You ask anybody, what's higher, revelation or concealment? Revelation. Bli gvul or gvul. Infinite is higher than the finite. But kol mokem, nevertheless, that's in their expression. Sheirish HaKelim, the root of the Kelim, hu l'mayla harbe m'sheirish ha'er. It's far higher than the root of a revelation of Gili. And now this is a piece that I mentioned the other day, is like, you usually don't find this in my Marim. It's usually the off the record, in between lines that the Rebbe Rashab would say to Chasidim or Teira Shalom in his Sichos. But he puts this in the Maimer, and you'll see in a minute that it's an explanation. What's the proof? Like I said before, Oyer also comes from the Esem. So what's the proof that the Keli is deeper? But Rayel is and a proof to this is that in Metzias Oyer min Atzmus, the existence of Oyer as it emerges from Atzmus, Zeu Dover Amusig B'Sichlenu. That's something that we can understand with our intelligence. It's a seichel logical statement. He's going to explain why. Even though that in truth, Atzmus is truthfully negates Oyer, because God is not a source, God is not like a sun that is the source for light. God is beyond light. He's Muslim in Na'ir. Kamoi HaKeli, Ma'Keli. He negates, he's as distant from Oyer as he is from Keli. Va'er, who gam came bechinas mitzias, legabe Atzmus, and Oyer is also a mitzias. Compared to Atzmus, even though Oyer is ethereal and subtle and sublime, more than a Keli is mitzias, more than Oyer, but compared to Atzmus, Oyer is also mitzias. It's the existence, mitzias nimtza, of an existent entity. Whatever level of Oyer it is, it's still an existent entity. U'makol mokim, mitzias ha'er, min ha'atzmus u'dover ha'musig u'munach heitev b'sichlenu. Nevertheless, though Atzmus is beyond Oyer, once you have Oyer, it's something that's understood and well understood, and munach and leitzach. It means it's something that completely it resonates. B'sichlenu in our seichel. Why? Because it makes sense that the Eibishter, when he chooses to reveal himself, what will you see? Divine revelation. So it's true that Atzmus doesn't need it. Atzmus is beyond it. But Oyer is a natural expression, so to speak, in our seichel of godliness. The sun gives off light, and Atzmus, when he wants to, he also gives off light. He expresses himself. Oyer here means expression. Oyer means awareness. Oyer means consciousness. It means some form of expression and revelation. So it makes sense in the way we understand things. Again, this doesn't mean Oyer is Atzmus. It doesn't mean, like he says, Atzmus is removed from Oyer as much as from Keli, but the concept of revealing himself makes sense. Now, if you can say a chacham, a very wise person, he's fundamentally brilliant beyond any imagination. And he doesn't need to express himself. But when he does, that's a natural expression. He's expressing his brilliance. But Mashenka and Kelim, umitzias ha-Kelim ha'atzmus. But when you talk about Kelim coming from Atzmus, that's not logical. Muchrachim anu lezeh, shu yizbarach kol Yochel lahav is gam kimitzias dover. Here you need to come and say something more than just that this is God expressing himself. Being that Kelim are substance and their state of concealment, so you have to say that now you have to depend on God's kol Yochel power. Or you don't need kol Yochel. Al pi seichel. It's true God doesn't need to express himself, but expression doesn't require any stretch of the imagination that God could express himself. Of course he can express himself. But when you see Kalim, and Kalim don't reflect godliness in a revealed way. They're not a natural expression. So now you have to say, you have to say God is Kol Yochel. You need to invoke God's power to do anything, that he can even express himself, lahav is gamke mitzias dover, to create something that's mitzias dover. Oyer is a mitzias compared to Atzmus, but it's not a mitzias dover. All Oyer is a reflection of Atzmus. Remember, Oyer doesn't have any identity of its own. All it is revealing its source. So that is makes total sense. But now that you see something that does not reveal its source, how could that be? That could only come from Kol Yochel, to create a mitzias dover of Kalim. So the Rebbe Rashab says now, based on this rationale, this logic, Hasoga tivis, he says now, this natural understanding in our intelligence, hiraya muchachas, is an absolute proof that the root of the kelim comes from Yecholes. So that's the Kol Yochel, that God can do whatever he wants to do. You don't need that. You don't need to invoke Kol Yochel. All you have to do is say that God wants to reveal himself. You don't need to invoke something because there's nothing unnatural happening here. All that's happening is that Atzmus is revealing himself, like we spoke. God does not need to reveal himself in Oyer, but once Oyer is there, Oyer has no identity but Atzmus. So that makes total sense. You don't need to rely on Kol Yochel. Kol Yochel you rely on, that God can do anything when you see something that would not make sense on its own. Suddenly you see an entity called a Keli. And a Keli does not reflect on its source and has its own identity. Not like Oyer. It's like separate from, in its own consciousness. Yesh ma'ayin, that causes you to go to Kol Yochel, which is Yecholes. So even though it's true that Oyer also comes from the Yecholes of Atzmus, obviously. But on Oyer alone, you wouldn't know that, because like we learned in volume 2 in Ayin Tzadik Daled, from Oyer you could still say that maybe God is like a sun. Maybe he is a source of light. It's only the Kalim that teach you about Atzmus that's completely removed from everything, because the fact that he can create something that does not reflect himself. Imagine the sun, suddenly you saw from the sun emerged frogs or water or something completely there's something weird. The sunlight is the natural flow from the sun. Light and revelation reveals godliness because it's not sun. But suddenly you see coming from out of God a creation of something that doesn't reflect godliness. That, like he says in the Ger Sarkedesh, that hulav, that's a yesh, it doesn't even feel it has a source. That tells you that Atzmus is Kol Yochel. There's something about Atzmus that we do not understand in natural seichel. So the seichel is telling you that the Kalim teach you about the Kol Yochel, the Yecholes of Atzmus. It can only come from Yecholes more than the Oyer can teach us. Ukamoishin is barely ill, and as was explained earlier, Dibra Maschil Vahi Ha'onan Va'achesher V'yoyer. He's saying that it says there. I have to look it up. Could be that he already made this point there, but he's definitely referring us to volume 2, like he says below, page 940. Yeah. Now.
Yeah, I remember us learning that the Kalim give us some knowledge of what Atzmos is, in a sense, more than the Oyer.
Okay, good. So we're going to stop here. Anybody want to ask anything? Okay, so we stop here by the words, the end of the parentheses, middle of the page. And tomorrow we'll continue Ulechein. He's going to continue talking about the power of these Kalim.